she kind of wanted to play, but
Notice
she was
that.
also just slowly.
Yeah, she was like out of energy still.
Your hair grows pretty fast, Peter.
Yes, it does.
All right, so we got through the first quarter of verse 1 of Genesis 1. Actually, no, we got through the first 8 verses.
You still haven't pooped.
Genesis is gonna take a while.
Genesis will take however long it takes.
She'll be okay.
Oh, I did.
All right, so
Put on my tribes.
we are still in the creation account. We finished verse 8 last time. We got to the creation of the heavens and the declaration of their name. He called the firmament or the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now remember we mentioned this earlier, how from the very beginning you see how Hebrew timekeeping is done right at the creation. It starts at night and then goes to morning. And so to this day, our church calendar follows the Hebrew reckoning of time. A lot of people notice this. For example, Christmas Eve, you think of as, oh, that's what happens before Christmas. No, actually, that's not correct.
It's the start of
Christmas Eve is the start of Christmas. Once the sun sets, and when they had accurate timekeeping, they counted it at 6 o'clock. But originally it was just basically sunset. Sunset was when the day began. Christmas Eve is actually the beginning of Christmas.
yeah. Sabbath starts.
And the Sabbath starts at sundown, not at sunrise. And in a sense, you can see how it makes sense. The day is done. When is the day done? When the sun sets, right? Well, if that's when the sun sets and the day is done, that has to be the start of the next day as well. Otherwise, you have a period of time that's not counted part of any day. All right. So it's actually a fairly natural way of counting the time, if you think about it that way. All right. Now we come to the work of the third day. By the end of the second day, we still have the earth being without form and void. No shape. And now it's given a shape. And God said, "Let the waters which are under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And this is still the third day. So together on the third day happens both the formation of land as we know it, and also the filling of land as we know it, of the thing that comes most straightforwardly from earth, that is plant life, which comes in the next verses. All right, so let the dry land appear. Again, we repeat our caution as we always have, we always must when we're considering Genesis. Don't try to take these individual events and attach some scientific significance to them. Like, what is the dry land appearing? How did God do that? And the answer always has to be, you can have theories, but we don't know. Leave it at that. Leave it as that God differentiated the earth in such a way that now where there was nothing, there was just a watery mess. Now there are seas. Now there are dry land. Because he declares it to be so.
But do we know if Adam actually named everything?
Adam didn't name everything.
Did Adam name the atom?
What?
Did Adam name the atom?
No.
Adam named the animals.
You know what the word Adam means?
Giver of life?
It means man. The word Adam is the man. That's all it means. And so Adam being the first man has the name man. So you'll see this many times as we get later, especially into chapter 2, because in chapter 1, the does not appear yet as a name. When you translate it as the man or when you translate it as Adam is a manner of interpretation. And so different translations will use the name Adam in different places, and some just have the man all through, but it's very clear. Scripture uses the term the man, Adam, as a title, as a name. And therefore, it's proper to use it as a name in Genesis chapter 2. All right. Continuing. In verse 11, God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, and each according to its kind." So the very first living creatures that are created are the plant life. And right from the beginning, God establishes the concept of the kind. And again, don't try to equate kind with the scientific classification of species. We've got a very, in some ways, arbitrary method that we apply to creation, to all the creatures, to put them into a great big vast hierarchy. And that is just the mind of man bringing order to what he sees. These classifications aren't given to us by God. There's nothing wrong with them. They're useful, but ultimately in the end, we shouldn't try to look to some straight up correspondence. And where does someone go wrong here? Well, when they say, well, a kind is a species, therefore if we are able to create through the process of crossbreeding or manipulation or various things, or genetic or environmental pressures, arrive at a version of a creature or a plant that can no longer reproduce with the plants that it started from. Aha, we've created a new kind. That's not correct. So a classic example of this would be a dog. If you create a type of a dog through crossbreeding or selective breeding that can no longer reproduce with other dogs for various reasons or successfully do so, you can't say, well, it's a new kind of creature. No, it's not. It's still a dog. That's the point of Genesis. The kind is, this is a plant of this kind, and yes, its descendants will vary greatly from one another, but the descendants of the tree is still going to be a tree. The descendants of the smaller plant still going to be that herb plant. Maybe bigger, maybe smaller, but it's still going to be of the same kind of thing. And yes, now we with genetics can explain why that is. We can explain that, well, because the genes in the plant have to express themselves in whatever comes from that plant. Plants, of course, extremely flexible in how they express them, because you can have sexual reproduction where male and female plants create seeds, and then those plants and they spring up, but you can also have other forms, asexual reproduction, where parts of the plant just plant themselves somewhere else and a new plant's formed. They're very flexible in this way, but the point is that it always produces the same type of organism that it started with, however many variations it might have. And so when we get into the animals, that's especially important to keep in mind. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the third day. Now the question people will come to at this point between the third day and the fourth day is, well, how about there not being light yet? There's no sun, right? Because the sun is created on the fourth day. How did the plants survive? Well, again, we already know that there's light. We can't really come up with an explanation for what is the distinction between the light in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 and chapter 1 verse I cannot see, these numbers are too small. Chapter 1 verse 14. And we don't try to make an explanation. We just say that it's so. some people say that God actually did create all glowing, lighting things, but it wasn't until the fourth day that they could be seen as such, as distinct coalesced objects in the sky. All those are just speculations. The point is there's really no issue. There's no scientific problem with plants on the third day preceding the sun on the fourth day, unless we try to make it a problem.
I mean, we can't say that, oh, God already had set up all of these certain growth patterns and all this kind of stuff to follow this exact pattern. He made this stuff, and he made it to survive for a reason. He doesn't have to create this complex thing in a certain order or a certain pattern.
He doesn't. The interesting thing about it is those who attempt to reconcile everything into a just so story will often try to take each day as an extended period of time, not just a single period of night followed day. I would argue they have the more difficult problem here, reconciling Genesis. Because now they have to explain, okay, if you've got an entire age without the sun now, where there's still plant life, they have by far the bigger problem to overcome there if they're trying to make all these things fit some scientific theory just so.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now we come to verse 14, and we've moved now. And it's interesting. Everything was focused on the earth so far. You know, the heavens were separated out, but now the focus is on the earth. And now we step back, and now we're back to the heavens. And so there's a sort of a back and forth that takes place between these days. So we're back to the heavens, the expanse, the firmament. When you see the word in the old King James would say firmament. The newer translations generally say expanse. Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. And so here again, 14, to separate the day from the night. And yet, verse 4, God saw the light, God separated the light from the darkness. And so he separated the light from the darkness in verse 4, but he separates the light from the darkness again in verse 14. Can you explain that? I can't. Why is it done again? Well, again, I don't know. What we need to focus on here is the emphasis on day 4 here is the sun, the moon, and the stars, and their purpose, what they're for, why God made them. And he describes their purpose here in verse 4. He says they are for day and night, but they're also for signs, for seasons, for days and years. And this is exactly the way it is to this day, of course. The sun, the moon, and the stars define the seasons for us. It is only by the sun, moon, and stars. Say if you're at the equator, for example, where you don't have seasons. You got perpetual summer all year round. Yet, the sun itself still defines the seasons for you. Okay. And determines when the year starts and when the year ends. And so it has the sun, and then it says, and let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. So first of all, it doesn't say specifically which lights there are. It just says there's lights there. And so some people have pointed out, well, what if in the process of differentiating the earth into land and sea, the atmosphere now becomes transparent to see the lights that are there? And when God says, let there be, what he's really doing is he's clarifying the atmosphere so that they can all be seen, but that he actually created them on day 1. Is that the answer? I don't know. But it's certainly possible that you could read it that way. So he says, let there be lights in the skies. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And he made the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. And so again he repeats the purpose. The primary purpose of the lights is light and dark. The secondary purpose is days, seasons, months, and years. But all was good. And so the question people say, well, yeah, but it says he made the stars. He made the sun and the moon. And does that mean that he couldn't, that made here couldn't be that he actually had made them on day one? What we know is when God said these things, it was on that day. When God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, it was on that fourth day. We leave the rest of the questions as to exactly how that worked, whether there were pre-works of creation beforehand or not. Keep in mind, we're talking about the creation of the universe here, right? And we're describing the creation of the universe in human, extremely simplistic terms. We cannot expect precision in those terms to give us all of the details of everything that God did to bring about the creation as it now exists. We shouldn't demand and expect this because his purpose is to show what he has done, not every single detail about how he did it. Okay. You'll notice the emphasis on all these creation events ultimately is man. Day and night is for man. Dividing light and darkness is for man. Who cares about the days, the seasons, the months, and the years? Man does. The animals don't care. They notice that the seasons change, but they don't care if it's Monday or Thursday. Man cares. The lights that are in the sky, these are all focused on, these are for you. I am making all of these things for you. Okay. So that's the fourth day. Getting through a lot faster this time, of course, as we got the foundations laid. Day 5, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly across the expanse of the heavens. Okay, so this is the terminology here for the expanse is again important in its relationship to the birds, and why it's wise to limit the expanse to the sky proper as we understand it and see it from Earth, and not speculate about the universe at large. Because the expanse is where the birds fly. The birds do not fly in outer space. So again, the emphasis is here. They fly across the expanse of the heavens. The living creatures across the deep. He uses this word swarm as a mass of life that God calls into being. And I suppose an evolutionist would call it an explosion of life, and they do. You know, they talk about the Cambrian explosion of life, that all of a sudden, according to their theories, massive amounts of life suddenly appear on the Earth, and they don't really have a good explanation, according to their theories, as for why that would be, but they observe it, and they're honest enough to report it. So you got to give them credit for that. Okay. Anyway, I'm not saying that one corresponds to the other. I'm just noting that God speaks in a similar fashion on the fourth day, or the fifth day. And now again, the second time, we have the description. We'll get to here. He created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds. There's the kind again. And the winged bird, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the sea and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, day 1. Now what I find interesting about this is that God is making a distinction between plants and animal life, and you don't have God commanding plants to be fruitful and multiply. But he does distinguish the plants from the animal kingdom in such a way that he tells the animals to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And why? Well, they're a different kind of creature entirely. It's a distinction that you can see God making. Beyond that, we'll leave it at that. It is a distinction, of course, that man shares in this way, that God gives man the same command, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, but then he takes it a step further, as we'll see. Distinguishes man from the animals. He tells man to rule the earth. Dominate it. Dominate the earth. So we'll get there. All right. So now again, the 6th day. We reached the end of the 5th day. Now we're on the 6th day. Every other creature. Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. All right. It is interesting when you compare the creation myths of the ancient world with the way that the Bible describes all of these things, and how God notes that each of these creatures is a different type of creature that he himself, by his wisdom, has established, created, and now brings forward perpetually into the future. You don't see this in the other ancient creation myths in this way, in this careful, methodical, wise planning out. What do you see in the ancient world? Well, you got all these gods fighting each other, and one does thus, and another one is angry, and they do that, and then they fight, and they have a war, and then that causes this thing to be made, and one god gets killed and split up into pieces, which makes these parts of creation. It's all chaos. And now here we have Genesis, which stands unique in all those ancient texts, describing something entirely different. A God who speaks and makes an order methodically, carefully, that just simply works.
Right.
Because he has declared it, yeah?
We see that order, the order as always continued on to today. I mean, the order of the reasons why there's beasts according to their kind and creeping things. So you got your amphibians and you got your mammals and those according to their kinds.
Yes.
There's a food chain that all is very structured and very organized in our world.
Well, not only that, there's a built-in order that can adapt to any single circumstance that might happen in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, everything is there ready to be expressed. It's fascinating to watch how modern science has tried to come to grasp with life. And you had, even before there was evolution theory, you had Mendeleev in his theories of genetics. And so he did a lot of primary research in genetics that was before he knew what a gene was, before they understood what DNA was. And came up with all these things. And then we discovered DNA, and then we figured out the structure of DNA, and then we literally are able to read DNA and see all this stuff and have no idea what they're all for, but we know it's there. And yet, they thought they have everything figured out, and then they learned that you can understand where every single protein exists in the entire DNA chain, and it still doesn't tell you how it actually plays out in life itself. Where something changes environmentally, and all of a sudden, these parts of DNA light up and start doing things and are ready there to take over and adapt because the function to do it was already present in the DNA. Now, and I'm getting into a scientific area that has nothing to, it's a result of what God has done. But it does demonstrate the essential problem that evolution cannot answer with its current theories. They can only explain how genes become disabled to differentiate a creature in a loss of information, that they call a mutation. They cannot explain. They really have no theory, no comprehensive theory, that can explain how this entire massive, intricate, interactive, interrelated sequence of proteins got that way in the first place, such that it was able to adapt and express itself for the numerous environments that life finds itself in. The information is already there. And they tried to extrapolate and guess that, well, maybe it just kind of put itself together somehow. And there's lots of ways that you can dig into that and discover that the idea that all of this information could form itself out of nothing is incredibly unscientific, but we don't need to go into all those details, nor the statistical argument why it's just simply impossible, even if you go with the idea of mutations creating new kinds. They don't have enough time in the entire history of the universe that they lay out for it to actually happen. There's simply not enough time for that process to work for the formation of kinds as we see them. Because if there were enough time, we would see it happening constantly today. There's so many changes that are required in any given period of time that we'd see it happening right under our noses. And we don't. We don't see it. Okay. All right. Verse 24 and 25 are creation of everything that's not air life and sea life, land life. And then you say, well, what about the insects? Some insects are sea insects, and some insects are land insects, and all. Well, again, God doesn't give you every single detail of every single thing that He's done, but it fits in here somewhere. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So when it comes to the creation of man, now we see something that's utterly different in all the rest of the account of creation. Man now stands out as distinct from every other animal. Is he a land creature? Yes, he is. He's made on the same day as the land creatures, in fact. But man is made after God's likeness, which none of the other creatures are. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heaven, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Just described all life on planet Earth. Man is to govern and rule it, dominate it. And so now we have the first poetic verse in the Bible, verse 27. Yeah.
I find it interesting that it says our, plural.
Yes. Let us make man in our image. Now there's a lot of theories as to why the plural is used there. The most straightforward answer is that it is a reference to the Trinity, of course. The other possibility is it's what you call the royal we. Let us do this, speaking out of authority. Grammar does this. The third possibility that some point to is that God created the angels first, and He's speaking of us in that sense, even though He's the one actually doing it, as if He's got His court there saying, let us now do this, even though He is the one who's actually going to do it. The most straightforward answer is the Trinity.
I mean, you gotta remember, it says, God created the heavens and the world, the heavens and the earth. It's not the Father in God created the heavens and the earth. And like also in like
It
he
says
said, or like, he said, like, let us create this best, or what was I thinking? He said, let there be light, like this, and like we talked about how this could have to do with the Word of God, like the Holy Spirit, like talking about or speaking, but
the Son of God speaking.
yeah.
The Son of God is the speaker in Genesis.
Mhm.
Every time it says, and God said, that's the speaker. No, that's the Son. We have. Okay, no, it's fine. All right. Okay. So let us make man in our image after our likeness. We have the dominion. So God gives man the dominion. I would only point out here that to dominate is a violent word in Hebrew. And I would caution people that use arguments about death the wrong way as we get into Genesis chapter 3 coming up. So we're going to have you note this now and save it for then. Some have the idea that there is no such thing as animal death prior to the fall. And I do not believe that is correct. Some people are vehemently argue with me on this point. But I do not believe that that is correct. I believe that there were carnivorous creatures from the beginning, and when you stepped on a bug, it died. Okay?
When you put it that way.
Okay? When we get to the question of death, it is very clear, and it becomes a central point in the fall of man, that the devil focuses on bodily death as a lie, using the truth in a lying way, but God meant spiritual death. Sin entered the world, and death came through sin. Death came into man. Now, I'm not saying that man was going to die before. Luther actually has this position that I'm talking about, that, and when we get to this point, especially in Genesis chapter 2, we'll get into it more. Luther says there was death in the world, bodily death, but not spiritual death. And so what happens if man, has an accident? Well, God gave man the tree of life. The tree of life would restore man to perfect health. And why Luther says this is he points to what God says at man's fall. God says we have to cut man out of the garden, because if we don't, he'll have access to the tree of life and he'll live forever in his sin. And so we must cut man off from access to the tree of life, or else he'll be in a far, far worse condition, eternally in sin.
Yeah, take also the tree of life and eat and live forever.
Mm-hmm. And so this is why I think that, now why do people say this? Well, they want to have an explanation for why there is radioactive decay that makes the earth look ancient. And say, they'll say, at the fall, the physical laws of the universe changed in such a way that before there was no death and now there is death. And so everything that we know about how the universe functions today shifted and changed, and it's completely different now than it was prior to the fall. And again, there's just no justification for saying that in Scripture.
I understand. I thought I never heard this, your stance of it before. Actually, I'd always assumed the same thing, but I can't see anything in Genesis 3 that suggests that death didn't exist before. And in fact, what did I just read? Where Satan's bringing up the notion of death. If death didn't exist in the world, how would
They knew what
understand?
they knew what death was.
Right.
They knew what death
They
was.
understood what death was.
Yeah. But so I bring it up here because dominate the creatures. As we get into Genesis chapter 2, we'll see that the whole earth was not a garden and paradise. The Bible doesn't say that the whole earth was a paradise. The Garden of Eden was a paradise. The Garden of Eden was God's temple, where God dwelled with man. It was perfect in this way. All was good, but here was the paradise. And man's task, as defined here in this verse, is make the whole earth a paradise. Start from the garden, spread out and make the whole earth a paradise. And had man not fallen, that's what man would have been doing. Bringing all things now under control. Okay.
What I always saw that was the death of the eternal promise of like eternal life in heaven. When they died, they would go to heaven. So the death would be referring to their death of the promise for their.
So, no, I'm not saying that.
resurrection or-
I am saying man would never die before the fall. Man would not die because God made provision so that man would not die. Luther said, well, then what then would be in that theoretical world where man did not fall? What would be his final destination in the end? And Luther said that, well, his speculation is that God would do for man eventually what he did do for Enoch and others, where they would ascend to have spiritual bodies and become a heavenly spiritual bodily creature, much like Jesus is a glorified man. And our bodies in the resurrection will be like that. Our bodies will not be merely flesh and blood, but they will be spiritually glorified bodies that are similar to Jesus' body after he ascended into heaven. And so Luther speculates that had the fall not happened, that's where things would have gone. It is speculation, and he admits it, it's speculation. Okay, so I was just going to say verse 27 this is the first poetic verse in the Bible. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So there you have the first Hebrew parallelism, the poetry, the way Hebrew works, where you state something and you state it again in slightly different words. And so notice it says God created them, male and female. This account is not happening before what happens in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 is a second creation account. This is the creation of man in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2, we will get to the creation account in Genesis chapter 2. It is a different account describing the same events in different words, focusing on different things. Okay. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. So again, man is to fill the earth, and here's the word subdue and dominate. So he's given them the command. In verse 26, he said this is what they're supposed to do, and then now in verse 28, he gives them the command to do it. Subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, heavens, every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that hath the breath of life, I have given every plant for green food. And it was so. And God saw that everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. And thus we have the end of the 6-day account. And if you were to divide the chapters correctly, I believe we should actually make verses 1, 2, and 3 of Genesis chapter 2 should be part of chapter 1. Chapter 2 should start at verse 4. The chapter and verse divisions were invented by men, not by God, and sometimes they're put in unfortunate places. Because it's very clear that the end of the Genesis, or the chapter 1 account, is in the first 3 verses of chapter 2. To complete the week, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from his work, from all his work that he had done in creation. All right, so the seventh day is the Sabbath day. And it becomes eventually a commandment that this is the day that you're to worship God on this day that God set apart for his rest. Notice that that command is not given here to man. It was not given here. It was not given to Noah. It doesn't come until Moses. Right. And so the day is hallowed, set aside, and then ultimately becomes the established day of worship, along with other Sabbaths that are not on the seventh day, that the word can be used in a more generic sense of a feast day. So it continues until the eighth day comes. Until God, that is Jesus, arises from his rest on the eighth day, which is Sunday. And that becomes the Lord's Day. Jesus, so you have a pre-shadowing already in Genesis chapter 2 of Jesus resting from his labors. The labor of creating anew the nature of man on his cross by bearing his sin. And that's not the end of the story. Then he arises. And that's why we worship on the Lord's Day and not the seventh day. Because God hallowed all days by his Son Jesus Christ, by his resurrection from the dead. And this is the day that he is risen. And that's why from the very early times in the church, they began to worship on the Lord's Day. All right, end of chapter 1. End of, up to, we'll get the beginning chapter 2, verse 4 next time for the second creation account, where there are many interesting things.